Welcome back. So we had, just to recap from where we picked off from last week, we had gotten to the point to where Paul is essentially has completed his third missionary journey. He has just returned from addressing the Ephesian elders there to give them warning concerning what could happen, that even among their own, that they would have potentially false prophets arise. Now, Paul has been gone quite some considerable amount of time, and a lot has changed in Jerusalem, where you might say that a lot has escalated since he's been gone, being that these days that we're about to get into are the days of tension in Jerusalem. Okay. Now, we just have had the high priest Jonathan that has been murdered. There is tension in the temple. There's tension in the streets, and certainly there's their Roman guard. They are also on high alert. Okay. Now, Paul has just been informed about some of this concerning the zealots in the temple. And so he was told by the brothers how that, that there is 4 men that have taken this vow. And so they suggested that he do a religious gesture and pay for their vow, meaning that he would buy the livestock, and so that it would be offered in accordance to Numbers chapter 6 with the vow of a Nazirite. Now, Paul viewed this as a religious gesture, and he was willing to do so. We recall back from chapter 14 where he's kind of done these religious gestures along the way, in that he circumcised Timothy. Okay. Now, he had looked at this in the sense of that it wasn't a sacrifice for atonement. Ultimately, he knew that Christ would be the one that would be the atoning redeemer for sins. And so he looked at this in the sense that how we sometimes look at this, in that we have certain people today that might suggest that there's only one day of the week that we can worship. Okay, so we can sometimes go along with that because we, being the more mature Christians, can worship with them on Saturday or Sunday or Monday or Tuesday or any day of the week. So there's a lot of things like that we can give a little bit of leeway in being the mature Christian. Okay. And so many of the believers that were in Jerusalem at this time, that had not come to the full knowledge of which Paul had come to the conclusion. And so being that in accordance to circumcision, this had been settled from Acts chapter 15, when they came together for the council there to discuss. What Paul was essentially against was the fact that you had to be circumcised in order to be saved, or that you had to become a Judaizer or become of Judah in order that you might be saved. Okay, so he was absolutely opposed to that. However, he does this religious gesture to pay the vow so that he would be seen as one that was not against the law, which he wasn't. Romans chapter 3, verse 31, we established the law and so forth. Okay. So, and of course he had just relayed the message to the brothers concerning the fact that how through many works that the Gentiles were saved. And that's where we've kind of picked it up here. He's going into the temple, and he's assisting the 4 that have taken the vow in chapter 21, book of Acts. And we'll pick it up right here in verse 27 here. So, and so this gets to the point to where, again, the days of tension, and Paul is going to be arrested in the temple. In verse 27, and when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, this being Asia Minor, or you might think of modern day Turkey today, seeing him in the temple, In other words, they recognized him from his missionary trips from Ephesus, from Iconium, from Antioch of Pisidia. Seeing him in the temple, they stirred up the whole crowd, and oftentimes being the method that they use, this occurred in Antioch of Pisidia in chapter 13, also in Iconium, and then they followed into Lystra there as well. And so they laid hands on him, crying out and saying, "Men of Israel, help. This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place," or the inner courts there. And so, being that they were there from Asia, obviously they would have been traveling to and fro during the religious feast days, which Paul as well was, as we had talked about, was trying to be here just before Pentecost, and they would as well. But they recognized him, and so they stir the crowd up. And then verse 29, for they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all of the city were stirred up, and the people ran together, and they seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came. In other words, word went up to the fortress of Antonia, where the Roman guards and the Roman garrison were stationed there. Okay. And so word came to the tribune of the cohort, and he is identified in Acts chapter 23, verse 26 as being Claudius Lysias. And word had come that all of Jerusalem was in confusion. Okay. And we know that will be such the case future to us also. I'm sure you're very aware of that from Revelation chapter 11 there. And so he at once took soldiers and centurions and catch the direction, and he ran down to them, meaning that he leaves the Antonia Fort there and comes down the steps. And when they saw the tribune, being the mob, and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he inquired who he was and what he had done. Okay, so this puts us about the time frame of about 57, 58 AD. All right. And so verse 34, and some of the crowd were shouting one thing and some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered them to be brought into the barracks. And when he had come to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him." Now, at the same time of what we have here with the religious zealots in the temple, we also have, as I mentioned in the introduction there, how that there's actually these factions along the way that have risen up since Paul has been gone. Okay, specifically the faction of the Sicarii. These were very zealous people, zealous Jews that had taken the stance of nationalism. In other words, they wanted to liberate the Romans away from Jerusalem. They're called Sicarii because they were known as dagger-men. All right. And so essentially that was their weapon of choice. They would hide that dagger in their cloak. And so they would, in the streets, they would inflict a terroristic act upon officials, upon those that had collaborated with the Roman officers, Roman governor officials, and they would attack and stab these officials, essentially murder them in the street, and then they could very easily stash that dagger back into their cloaks and fade away into the public, into the crowds, and start at that point mourning and saying what has happened and blending in with the people. So they were very effective for establishing fear and terror, much like terrorists do as well in our generation. So this is the Sicarii. They're zealots. They had come to power during the time when Paul was away. By the time that they grow bolder and bolder, you get to the point of 66 AD, as I'm moving ahead in history here. 66 AD, you have the great Jewish revolt, all right? And then from there, they have the point where they flee, and they flee to the mountain of Masada, all right, to hold off in the last stand. And then, of course, in 70 AD, the Romans come in, they destroy Jerusalem, they burn the temple, they dispel all the Jews, and then the Romans will ultimately turn their attention back to the Sicarii in 73 AD, and they'll just be, at that point, surrounded as they surround Masada, and then the Sicarii have no other choice other than to commit mass suicide, and that's essentially what happens there. So, ending their reign and their rebellion and their terror. Okay, so that will kind of come up as we read the next few verses here. And so, verse 37, and as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek?" So he's kind of taken back by this. And he says, "Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" And so essentially he had this Ethiopian. He had come up to the Mount of Olives. He was a false Messiah type. And he had said, at my command, the walls of Jerusalem are going to fall and so forth. Well, the Roman guards chased him out of there, and he had to basically flee from that area there. So that's essentially what happened. He kind of assumes that Paul is the leader of that rebellion in his mind, because he's thinking, like, why else would they be beating this guy? Okay. And so Paul replied and said, "I am a Jew, okay, from Tarshish in Cilicia." Okay. Now, technically speaking, Paul was not a Jew, okay? He states in so much from Romans chapter 11 that he's actually of Benjamin, all right? And so I take this to be better understood as he's relaying the message that he's one of the dispersa. And being that he was from Tarshish of Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city, in other words, suggesting that his citizenship could be verified, I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people, and there was a great hush. And he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense I now make before you." And when they had heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, "I am a Jew." In other words, I am properly understood to be of those of the dispersa or diaspora there. Again, Romans 11, Paul was not technically of Judah, he was of Benjamin. Born in Tarshish of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. He's going to recount what happened on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 19. And he states, I persecuted this way, meaning the Christian way, to death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. As the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. And from them I received letters to the brothers, and I sojourned toward Damascus to take those also who were there and to bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. And I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And this being Christ. And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now, those who were with me saw a light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came to Damascus, into Damascus there. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken by all of the Judeans who live there, he came to me, and standing by me, he said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour, I received my sight and saw him. And so you recall there from Acts chapter 19 or Acts chapter 9 that Ananias had received word concerning Paul or Saul before he even arrived there. And so verse 14, and he said, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear the voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. And so we're going to get just a little bit more detail, as we know that obviously Paul was struck down on the road to Damascus. What's less known is the fact that what we're going to read in verse 17 here. And when I had returned to Jerusalem and I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance. So I didn't know if you knew that Paul as well had fallen into this trance at Jerusalem, and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. In other words, from Acts chapter 9, verse 29 and 30, they were seeking and sought to kill him. Okay. And so, and I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another, I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when this blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I was standing by, and being that this would be in Acts chapter 7, the first martyr, and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. So Paul's kind of laying back to the Lord, say, hey, they think I'm on their team and they don't really have a reason to kill me. However, now that he has converted, and the fact that once wind comes up to them as far as they know that he is converted, their number one boy or number one scholar has changed teams, and obviously they want to kill him for that. Okay. And so, but the Lord again tells Paul, saying in verse 21, and he said unto me, go, I will send you far away into the Gentiles. And so that would be where he picks up with his first missionary trip, along with Barnabas, starting off with Cyprus into Pergia, Pamphylia, Antioch, and so forth. Okay, Iconium. And then the second trip, all the way up into Greece, Philippi, Thessalonica, as places that we also studied as well. And then this third trip, spending a great deal of time in Ephesus. Okay. So being that he was sent for that part of the three missions that he had to the kings and to the Gentiles and to those of the Judah and the tribes of Israel there. So now, still, again, Paul relaying the events as far as what had happened, and he kind of goes a little bit overboard when he mentions the Gentiles, because for the fact to insinuate that the Gentiles are in any way equal to Judah was essentially an abomination to them. They just did not have that mindset. And so we remember that even for the Christian believers, such as even Peter, and that he had a lot of struggle with this as well, as because from Galatians, the book of Galatians, Paul had to address down Peter in that he was eating with the Gentiles, and then he would pull back once those of the tribes of Israel would come near. Okay, so verse 22 and up to this word, they listened to him. And so when he mentions the Gentiles, then you want to pay close attention to the they, being predominantly, most likely, Kenites in the crowd. And they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth. Again, what has he really done? He's teaching about the Lord. They have short-sighted their belief in the fact that they thought that he was teaching against the law, which he wasn't. And for he should not be allowed to live. And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, and saying that he should be examined by flogging. And so the tribune's about to make a big mistake here, okay, for the fact that it was against Roman law for any official to actually bind a Roman citizen with chains, or to flog any Roman citizen without the appeal to Caesar, and also to get the permission to also be to go to court and have a trial. Okay, and so that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" And when the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to them, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." And so the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." And the tribune answered, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." And Paul said, "But I am a citizen by birth." And so, that being the case with some of these Roman officers, you recall back in the area of Philippi, being that it was a Roman colony just after the wars that had taken place. A lot of the Romans officers and army there were allowed to settle in that area, being in that area of Philippi. And so he had bought his citizenship and paid a large sum, but Paul by birth. And so those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. And the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. Okay. So I think that's a good place to stop. And again, these being the days of tension, you've got zealots in the temple, you've got Sicarii, these dagger-men that would inflict pain, terroristic acts in the streets to sway the public. They want control of Jerusalem. They want the Roman government off the back of Jerusalem. However, as I previously mentioned, Jonathan, the high priest, and so forth, they were looking to make a deal with the Roman government. Okay. And so they had him killed. And being that Paul is right in the mix of it, he's caught up with it. And so he's trying to make his testimony clear and plain. However, they are just not going to have it. So again, we're about the time frame of 57 AD, somewhere in that ballpark. This will continue to escalate and escalate for Paul, as well as he'll be brought before the Roman governor Felix, and as well as the Sicarii themselves. In 66 AD, this comes to a head where you have that Jewish revolt. And then ultimately, just a matter of a few years later, in 70 AD, you have the Roman general Titus will actually come in and dispel all of the revolters at that point. Because even within the revolters, there is schisms between the Sicarii and the zealots. All right. And so the zealots will be forced to flee, as I mentioned, up to Masada. Masada being the place that Herod, and we've made the note of Christmas Herod. He's the one that built Masada up, okay, for somewhat of a vacation place, as well as in case there was such a case as a Jewish revolt here. Okay. So I think we'll stop there, and Paul will be coming before the council. And then ultimately, Claudius Lysias will be forced to send a letter to explain what is happening, and we'll have him further examined. And then we'll ultimately get to the point where he starts talking to Agrippa II. Okay. I hope you enjoyed that quick and fantastic Bible study. Lots of information, lots of history, lots of going on. The days of tension are really ratcheting up, and stay tuned, and we'll continue into the next chapters here. All right. God bless.